Canada's latest visa meltdown. Objects to visa trouble for Khalistanis. Canada cries foreign interference. Embrace K-terror, want Indian visas.
Respect for international law and commitments.
India's visa slap to K-clowns.
The Khalistan terror backers in Canada are upset that Khalistan terror backers are either being denied visa, that's their allegation, or the visa is being delayed, or they're being asked to profess their deep love and respect for India. They also have to sign a form renouncing separatist activities. The government of India has officially not reacted to this report, an investigation that's been carried out in Canada. But the question remains, why is Canada upset over visas being denied to Khalistan terror backers or separatists? Canada should be more concerned about the activities of the Khalistani terrorists and criminals in their country, whether they're running drug running or gun running or human trafficking. They have a free run in Canada. Worse, Canada has denied visas to veterans who've served in Jammu and Kashmir and in Punjab. We debate this threadbare. I'm Gaurav Sawant as always. Let's get started with the headlines at 10. Opposition ups the ante against Rajya Sabha chair, submits a notice for Jagdeep Dhankar's removal. The Congress chief Mallikarjun Kharge calls Dhankar the biggest disruptor in Rajya Sabha. The George Soros-Adani storm rages on in Parliament. BJP claims Rahul Gandhi's aunt is a relative of George Soros. Rahul Gandhi says Congress wants the House to run despite BJP's provocation. Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee hints at leading the India bloc again. Mamata Banerjee says she's thankful to those who want her as the leader of the opposition bloc. Bengaluru techie suicide probe intensifies. Atul Subhash's mother-in-law calls the allegations against her daughter baseless. Atul's family demands justice. Foreign Secretary briefs the Parliament on his Dhaka visit. Sources say Mohammad Yunus's interim government assures India of action against attack on Hindus and other minorities in Bangladesh. Our top focus story on this special broadcast is a report that emerges from Canada. Canada calls India's alleged denial or reported denial of visas to Khalistani terror backers as foreign interference tool. India apparently has taken a very firm stance on denying visas to certain Canadians, particularly those who openly support the Khalistan separatist cause. The Canadian media is labeling this as foreign interference. However, this action is well within Government of India's rights, given the growing concerns over Khalistani-linked violence and threats, not just in Canada, but also in India. Indian interests are being impacted in Canada, and Khalistani separatists, criminals and mafia are trying to call the shots even in India. We get you more in this report.
India is actively denying visas to Canadians who embrace the Khalistani cause. You would think this would be most appropriate, legitimate and timely. Given the rampant culture of violent threats that Khalistanis have been pointing at India and Indian officials for several years, but Canadian news organization Global News calls it an investigation that has revealed foreign interference. The article, posing as a major expose, reports that India has simply been exercising very reasonable rights of visa denial to people found to be openly embracing a cause that publicly calls for harm against India and Indians. has direct links with Pakistan's ISI and has demonstrated real-world threats against persons of Indian origin in Canada and the United States over the last few years. As if to suggest coercive and cruel action, the article reports that Canadian Khalistanis were told they would get visas only if they denounced Khalistan and acknowledged India as their country of origin. It is unlikely that any reasonable citizen of either country would consider visa denial on these grounds as a violation of rights. Forget about foreign interference. But that is just how India-Canada ties have sunk. Global News, a prominent media outlet, is part of a Canadian media ecosystem that has been happy to carry government plans against India in the ongoing tussle over the death of terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a case that has brought India-Canada relations to a historic low. In Canada, some proponents of the Khalistan cause have been associated with hate speech, threats against Indian officials, and public glorification of violence, raising legitimate concerns for Indian authorities. Diplomatic missions have the responsibility to safeguard their home country's interest while operating within international norms. The actions attributed to the Indian consulate conditioning visas on distancing oneself from a separatist movement falls squarely within the realm of legitimate diplomatic practice. Visas are not an entitlement, but a privilege granted at the discretion of the issuing country. For India, the Khalistan issue is not merely a political disagreement, but a matter of sovereignty and security. The question now is, will India go further than just deny visas and turn the screws further by cancelling PIO, OCI cards, and crack down on the Indian bank accounts and properties of Khalistanis in Canada? Bureau Report, India Today.
India is very clear. Enough is enough. For decades, Canada has supported Khalistani terrorists and separatists, and I'm using the word terrorists with great caution. Remember the Air India aircraft that was targeted by Khalistani terrorists? Justin Trudeau's father was then the Prime Minister of Canada. Despite India's intelligence inputs, they did nothing to check the Khalistani terrorists. Then, sadly, the son follows in his father's footsteps. But listen to India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, who is very clear. He calls a spade on Khalistani terror.
I think what happened yesterday at the Hindu temple in Canada was obviously deeply concerning. You would have seen the statement first by our official spokesperson and also the expression of concern by our Prime Minister yesterday. That should, I think, convey to you how deeply we feel about it.
Political space today, which is being given to extremist forces there. So we believe in freedoms. We also believe freedom should not be misused. And have we had a talk about it? Exactly on the rights.
In Canada, actually, today the party in power in Canada, other parties in Canada have given these kinds of extremism, separatism, advocates of violence a certain legitimacy in the name of free speech. See, when you tell them something, their answer is, no, 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 we are a democracy, but it is free speech. But the point that they need to understand, this kind of, it's no longer a world which runs as a one-way street. That if there are things which happen out there, there will be pushback. The Newton's law of politics will apply there also. The Khalistani issue is not a new issue. The Khalistani issue has existed for decades. The issue at heart is the fact that in Canadian politics, these Khalistani forces have been given a lot of space and have been allowed to indulge in activities which I think are damaging to the relationship, clearly not in India's interest, but I would argue not in Canada's interest. They seem to be driven by vote bank politics. And their responses have all been, to the best of my understanding, actually constrained by what they regard as vote bank compulsions.
You heard India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Newton's law of politics will apply. And I want to bring in our guest on this special broadcast. Sushant Sareen is a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Ambassador Vivek Kaju is former secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Has very, very strong views on Canada's support to terror and the double standards applied by Canada. Daniel Boardman is a senior correspondent at the National Telegraph, joins us from Toronto. But Sushant Sareen, is this the application of the Newton's law of politics? India finally responding?
Well, I think this is a story which dates back from what I remember 2016, 2017. But I think what is important is that at this point in time, this should actually become formal Government of India policy. It should not be a kind of an informal policy. In fact, if people are applying for visas, we should extract as much information as possible in official visa forms from people applying from Canada, because we have an apprehension of a threat emanating from that country, from certain people who are given a free hand in Canada, who carry out very pernicious and poisonous propaganda against India, who are involved in transnational crimes in India, drug trafficking, human trafficking, you name the crimes, they're involved in it. They're involved in assassinations in India. And these are people, we need to get all the information possible from them. Don't the Canadians, when you apply for a visa for Canada, don't they ask you, for example, of your entire financial records, where all you have a bank account, how much money you have in your bank, etc., etc. There are a dozen documents they ask you for. Is that interference in India's affairs? So,
and not just that, Ambassador Kaju, they asked much more, and especially if you're from the armed forces, and perhaps that should be seen as direct interference in India's internal affairs. But has India been far too kind and for far too long, despite the Kanishk bombing? And what do you make of Canada calling this as interference, as a foreign interference tool, sir?
I've long believed that Canadian approaches to grant of visas is nothing short of racist. And I use that word deliberately, because that was my experience as a diplomat, as secretary in the External Affairs Ministry, when I was entrusted with overseeing Indo-Canadian relations. The reason
How is this
why
racist? Can you explain that, sir?
Yes, I think I should, because it's a strong word that I've used. The Canadians ask any member of the Indian security forces where he has served. This is also about Indian intelligence retired members of the Indian intelligence. Now, many of them have relatives in Canada and they want to visit those relatives. They go to Canada for tourism purposes. So in these cases, they ask for full details of their service record. Now, this is never done. It's completely intrusive to ask people for their service record. In many cases, it's confidential information. I say it's racist because I don't think that the Canadians would ask any of the security personnel of their G7 partners who have served in, say, Afghanistan, who have served in Northern Ireland, the same thing. We know that there have been allegations against these people too, these servicemen of these countries, for committing human rights violations. Have the Canadians asked them? Is it part of their routine investigation? So why is it only for India and some other countries? Okay. If this is not racist, then what is racist? That they have concerns that they have no concerns that a British officer or service person may have committed human rights violations in Northern Ireland. That's not probed. An American or an Australian may have committed human rights violations while serving in Afghanistan. That is
Yes.
not looked at. But if any Indian retired army officer or any other BSF officer, for instance, has
Okay.
served in Jammu and Kashmir, then he's asked. And naturally, the inference for this probing is that he may have committed human rights violations. And I know that as a rule, these persons are not allowed visas. One last.
In fact, I've spoken to several such officers, both of the Army and the Central Armed Police Forces, who were denied visa and were extremely upset with this attitude of the Canadian government. But
Well,
Daniel, if I could... Go on, sir. You want to quickly complete your point? Go on, sir.
Yes. I recollect that as secretary, I called in the Canadian High Commissioner and I said, you have no business to ask for confidential information from a retired Indian service person. Now, I regret to say that many of our service personnel gave this information, perhaps
Yes.
out of ignorance, but they did. So so that is why I say that it is racist. Now, my last point, and that's important. It is completely within the sovereign right of India to deny someone a visa who is acting against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country. And
Yes.
for this purpose, if information is needed, then it is within the sovereign right of India to ask for that information. And I draw a distinction between territorial integrity and sovereignty and so-called human rights violations. When you are fighting with terrorists.
Absolutely. And here Canada seems to be backing terrorists. And Daniel, it just kind of defies common sense. Why would Canada be upset if India wants to ensure that India is safe, not just from separatists, but from criminals and mafia and terrorists who may profess the Khalistani cause?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't understand this global news story. It's preposterous. It's ridiculous. Stuart Bell is usually a very good journalist. I don't know why he would do this. Listen, you're right. A country has the right. Maybe the Canadian government really just doesn't understand that countries are sovereign and have a right to determine who comes through their borders. Open mass migration and, unfettered mass migration has been a hallmark of the Trudeau government. So maybe they just sort of expect everyone else to do that. And listen, India has the right to grant visas to whoever comes into their borders. This is standard. And on a scale of 0 to 100 of strict enforcement of visas and border controls, forcing Khalistanis to fill out a standard form saying, I'm not a terrorist, out of a level of 100, this is a 3 in terms of securing the country. Just make them sign a piece of paper saying terrorism is bad. Is this going to stop anyone? No. I mean, there are things you can do, right? You brought up canceling OCI cards. There's a whole list of things you could do. You could just not let the Khalistanis into the country, but you're letting them into the country as long as they sign a letter saying terrorism is bad. And we call this foreign interference because Canadian citizens are forced to sign a letter that they don't want to destroy India, and this is somehow a deeply Canadian value. It's preposterous. It's one of the most ridiculous stories I've heard. Now, I will push back on Canada being a racist country granting visas. No, Canada has also a sovereign right to put visas on them. And listen, there's a reason why Indian Army officials and Australian and American Army officials are different. We're in the Commonwealth. Australia and Canada and US are all in NATO and in alliances. Now, you can talk about the unfair rules put on sort of Indian army officials who fought terrorists in Jammu and Kashmir, and it's indicative of the same thing that Canadian bureaucrats are also going to try and maybe impose on Jews or Israelis who should be our allies as well. Like India is an allied democracy, right? There's a moral inversion. I don't think it's racism.
I will get Ambassador Kajju to respond to that, but it's actually a contradiction. Radical Islamist terrorists are coming into Canada. There are no checks on them, but there are checks that are being put on Indian Armed Forces veterans or Central Armed Police Forces veterans. It just defies logic unless, Sushant Sareen, unless this too is a part of some deep state operation where Canada is just perhaps the pistol and the trigger is being pulled elsewhere by the deep state elsewhere, Sushant Sareen?
Yeah, Gaurav, if this is a deep state operation, then that deep state is remarkably stupid. Because this is a really clumsy kind of a report which has been published. And I think Daniel probably is trying to guess how. I've never heard of this guy, this journalist, but maybe his check depended on it because much of Canadian media is funded by Trudeau's government. So maybe his next check depended upon a story as ridiculous as this one. It should have never made any page, forget the front page, but fine. Canada is no longer a serious country under Justin Trudeau anyways. But I think the far more important point for me is that despite the fact that the government officials in Canada had initially refused this character Khalistani fellow a visa, subsequently he was granted a visa. I would want those government officials who granted him a visa later on to be hanged until, hanged to death for having given a Khalistani a visa, first and foremost. Secondly, why is the government still sitting on a very simple thing that review all OCI cards, review all long-term visas which have been granted, bring in the blacklist, please blacklist not just these Khalistani thugs who are operating from Canada, but their families, because their families are very much involved in this activity. I think if we need to secure India, the government of India twiddling its thumbs does not make any sense to me. But the problem, however, is the moment you start doing this, some of the bureaucrats and politicians, they will be very scared that, we will not get visas then. And if that is, if your entire foreign policy operates on your children and your relatives being able to get visas to Western countries, then let's not have a foreign policy.
Okay, but I'm very sure because India does take a hard line. But let me get Ambassador Kajju to respond to a very pertinent point raised both by Daniel and by you. And Ambassador Kajju, if you permit, should India then take it to the next level, identify and freeze assets of the Khalistanis, their relatives and their enablers, Ambassador?
I don't know whether we have the legal provisions to do that. But let me respond to a couple of points that have been made. First, the deep state. It's been my experience that the so-called deep state is stupid. That's been my experience of because we know, as a former diplomat, I know what constitutes a deep state. Second, why do I use the word racist? It so happens that the Canadians are soft on which allies? Aren't all these allies essentially of countries, or these allied countries, Caucasian countries? And these Caucasian countries, no questions are asked.
Okay.
There have been reports of the most grievous kind of human rights violations committed by sections of the US armed forces in Afghanistan.
And in Iraq. Yes, sir.
And in Iraq and elsewhere. Now, are probing questions asked of Americans, service personnel, if they want to visit Canada? If not, why not? If there's a discrimination between them and our personnel who are combating terrorism, then if that discrimination is not racist, how else should I categorize it?
Okay.
And last point, and this is addressed to Sushant. Look, let's be absolutely honest with ourselves. The fact is that there is a huge Indian diaspora in Canada, and they have influential relatives in India. It's all very well to say that we should be a strong state. Your political system is not impervious to influence, and officials and of the Ministry of Home Affairs who finally decide on these issues, and politicians come under these such influences.
Okay.
When relatives, marriages are there, deaths take place here, and so in those circumstances, then officials are constrained, and they
Perhaps
are authorized.
that is where this awareness needs to be created. But the last 30 seconds that I have on this part of the show, Daniel, hasn't Canada seen the dark side of these Khalistanis already, with the shootings that go on, with the criminal activities, the gun running, the drug running, the human trafficking, the mafia, the Khalistani mafia that operates? Hasn't Canada woken up yet?
The Canadian people have. We've seen it. The Trump administration sees it and is threatening tariffs. The problem is the political establishment benefits off of it. It's Canada's economy. Post Stephen Harper under Justin Trudeau, got rid of our resource industry. We're now based off money laundering, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. And this is a major, major problem, but the Liberal Party makes money off of it. And it's not racism, because we are highly friendly to Pakistan, and we are highly friendly to Qatar, and we are highly friendly to foreign radical ideologies who hate us. It is moral confusion. And this slander you've thrown against U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, who fought ISIS.
It's not slander. I've reported from Abu Ghraib, Daniel. I've reported from Abu Ghraib. I've seen what U.S. forces did in Iraq. I've reported on what they did in Iraq. I witnessed it firsthand, sir. No, sir. It's not slander. It's high time the world actually opens their eyes and does not find it acceptable just because it's the Americans. But we'll keep a track on that story very, very closely. We report from across the world without fear or favor. But I've run out of time on this part of the show. Daniel, as always, many thanks for joining me. Ambassador Kaju and Sushant Sareen.